I'm Aaron Lyon, and I'm going to introduce our speaker today and provide a little bit of an overview of the SMART Center, which is happy to be hosting Dr. Ann Gregory today. Really appreciate everyone joining us. And please note that all attendees are muted, and we will be recording today's session and posting it on our event page. But welcome to our latest SMART Center speaker series. So just to orient you where we are in our 2021 speaker series, we are happy to be hosting Dr. Ann Gregory today. This is our second in our speaker series coming up for the remainder of the academic year on April 7th. We have Eileen Schwartz along with Ginger Kwan talking about using a racial equity theory of change to facilitate collaboration between university researchers and community-based organizations. On May 5th, we have Emma Elliott Groves discussing Indigenous systems of relationality and designing for transformative agency in Indigenous community psychology. And then on June 2nd, we have the SMART Center's own Janine Jones discussing culturally responsive school mental health intervention. So it's a fantastic lineup. We are very excited about it and hope that you'll be joining us also for subsequent talks. I also want to begin, as we do at all SMART Center events, with a land acknowledgement. And the University of Washington SMART Center acknowledges that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. I want to just provide a quick overview of the way we think about our work at the SMART Center. And really, we focus on two primary gaps. The first is the access and utilization of mental health services broadly defined. And the second is quality of those services. And we recognize that these are two long-standing and important gaps. Being able to get to the mental health services that are going to be beneficial or may be indicated for youth and families. And that there are major gaps and historical gaps and inequitable gaps related to that. And that there's also even, an important gap related to service quality, and that even the most accessible service, if it's not of high quality, if it's not likely to be effective, isn't going to be particularly beneficial, especially at a population level. I just want to make the point that these two gaps are interdependent and complementary. And just as an ineffective accessible service may not have the impact on public health that we're looking for, neither will a very effective but ineffective service. So that's really what we're focused on at the SMART Center. Our overarching mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, behavioral needs of all students through research, training, technical assistance, and support to policymaking. I'm Aaron Lyon and happy to be one of the SMART Center co-directors. Here you have us during during the days when we could do things like all be together in a room that we hope to get back to as soon as possible, as I know we all do. Next slide. I want to direct you to our website for a moment, where we have information about the various projects we work on, the kinds of ways that we work, various publications, etc. Also provide a little information about our school-focused supplement to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. The team here listed at the top, Kelsey Schmitz, Megan Lucy, Natalie Flores, Eric Bruns, have been largely responsible for this session, along with in collaboration with our SMART Center postdoctoral scholars. And the Northwest MHTTC provides support throughout Region 10 of the US surrounding school-based mental and behavioral health services. And you can check them out there. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our Smart Series speaker for today, Dr. Anne Gregory, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers, has been very influential in her work surrounding disparities in out-of-school suspension and expulsion and inequitable discipline by race, gender, and sexual orientation. She is and has been principal investigator on grants to support this work from sources like the U.S. Department of Education, and the William T. Grant Foundation, all kind of focused in one way or another on equitable school discipline and discipline practices, has numerous publications on restorative practices and racial equity in school discipline and reducing disproportionality in discipline in schools. And I just learned moments ago, used to live in Seattle back in the 90s. So although we weren't able to bring her in person back to us to spend a little time hanging out with our team, we are very happy to be welcoming Dr. Gregory virtually today. So I think we can go to the next slide and I will pass it off to her. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm excited to start today a kind of a robust presentation. So first I want to thank Dr. Eric Bruns and Dr. Erin Lyon and for the invitation to come talk today. And of course, Megan Lucy, the program coordinator. I really appreciate pulling this together. Many of us have been on many, many webinars and many of you are very early right now. So I just want to kudos to you for coming out for another webinar. I do have a lot to cover today. I have about 60 slides or so. I'm going to go fast. You'll have access to the slides. So if I move too quickly through a slide, please forgive me in my enthusiasm to kind of share some lessons learned through the last decade or so of work. So first of all, again, it's an honor to be here. Many of you are on the forefront working with it. You are educators, you're working with students and families. Many of you are on the forefront of educational research. And it's exciting to be part of this community. And I want to kind of back up and say a little bit about kind of what brought me to this work over the last years and what drives me. And I'm going to traverse many, many research studies today. And so bear with me as we go through it, but I really think there'll be clear practice implications. And I'm looking forward to a rich Q&A at the end of the presentation today. So I'll be speaking for about 45, 50 minutes. You know, hang in there during the PowerPoint Zoomathon. So here we go. So for the past 15 years, I've been working in a growing area of research and advocacy. Now, there's been a lot of results and shifts across states and districts and schools in their use of what's called exclusionary discipline. There's been reforms in policy and practice. So when we think about exclusionary discipline, it's typically kind of conceptualized as suspension, expulsion, office discipline referrals. And these many reports, this is just a few that I grabbed. There's just so many, we could layer many, many on. And it really culminated, in my perspective, some of this work in 2014. Some of us may recall there was something called a Dear Colleague letter that came out through the US DOJ and the US DOE that was drawing the link between school discipline and racial discrimination. And there was a lot of guidance offered on how to kind of improve school climate. So that was in 2014. So that was some years ago. Here we are in a different place, obviously, but there's been some shifts and reductions in school exclusionary discipline. We have yet to see, again, how the pandemic has shifted some of these trends. And there'll be many of us eager to learn more about that. But let me show you, if I might, a report that came out not long ago by Lawson and Martinez that pulled together national data on school suspension rates. So what you'll first see is that there's this kind of curve, this reduction in suspension rates over the years. So this is data that was, the last time point is 15-16. But what will really pop at you is that red line, right? That this is the line for African-American or Black student suspension rates. And you can just see this glaring disparity. And then I'm going to show you kind of by level. So this is middle and high school, the secondary levels versus elementary. What I want to draw your eye to is the dashed red line on the bottom. And there you'll see African-American students and Black students in elementary school, and you see disparities right there. You can see the 15, 16, that the disparities for Black students are really starting in elementary school, and then they're kind of rising through high school. That's the implications of this. Now, one thing I want to point out, I'm going to show you a lot of kind of data slides today, but I really want us to stay away from the risk of intellectualizing. These are many, many students' lives have been impacted by these experiences of exclusionary discipline. There's a lot of loss and a lot of stress behind this. And I don't want to lose that in the experience of these kind of cold, hard graphs. The other thing that's missing from this graph are the many other groups that have been overrepresented in discipline. So for example, American Indian students and students with special needs have been persistently shown to be overrepresented in school discipline. So I want to make sure to point that out. And then of course, these categories are very simplistic we have here in terms of these racial and ethnic groupings. We know that we're all living these kind of complex, multiple social identities, complex intersectionalities, to bring in that academic term. We know that LGBTQ students, male students, and low-income students as groups have all been shown to be overrepresented in exclusionary discipline. A lot of the research, though, has been focused on comparing Black students and white students in discipline. And so a lot of us have thought about this really kind of as this discipline snowball starting early in schooling. Sadly, suspension gaps start in pre-K. It's kind of hard to get your head around that, but that is true. And we can think about a snowball of a student kind of fraying in their trust of adults, in their sense of belonging, lost instructional time accruing. And what I really want to point out to you, and I think many of you on the call know this already, but I think it just deserves repeating, that there's been many rigorous studies to show that suspensions can increase risk for dropout. So if you have a student who's kind of on a negative trajectory in some way, and then they receive suspensions, it's really pushing them more towards dropout. And there's also been rigorous studies showing that it increases the odds of students will be later arrested. And this has been the term school to prison pipeline has been used in reference to that. Now, many studies have shown kind of complex contributors to this phenomenon. And I think about these contributors as manifestations of structural racism that we see in economic and racial segregation in terms of opportunity structures and opportunity gaps in neighborhoods and schools. And many researchers and educators are really trying to grapple with racial disparities in schools related to specifically differential treatment of Black and white students. So I'm just going to share one study. I'm going to show you one study. I just want to point it out to you because I think it's a good illustration of the multiple contributors, but yet the kind of civil rights and racial justice issues that arise when we look at school discipline. So we see in the orange bar that when these researchers who are analyzing Kentucky data, we see the gap, the odds a Black student was suspended, the odds relative to white students kind of goes down when you enter into kind of school membership or school effects. And the odds further, the gap goes down again when the researchers put into the model student, which is a stats term, but just think of it as students with similar student socioeconomic status, gender, special ed, and family structure. But what I really want to point out is that even with these considerations in mind, when students are similarly situated, which is a term used in the legal community, the odds a Black student was suspended in this study were still about 2.5 times higher than a white student. And what many studies have corroborated this kind of finding, that Black and white differences in income, perceived behavior, and achievement do not explain away all of the Black and white disparities in discipline. So they do not explain away. And again, many researchers and educators are grappling with this, trying to understand more about things like explicit bias and racism and implicit bias. And I'll just share again one study that some of you may be familiar with, which I think has struck many of us. This was a study that came out with Gilliam and colleagues, and they tracked the eye gaze of education teachers watching a video of preschoolers. And the teachers were told that some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. And they requested that when they saw behavior, they would indicate to the researchers when they saw behavior that might become a potential challenge. Now, unbeknownst to the participants, none of the videos contained challenging behavior. And they tracked the educators' eye gaze as they were watching these clips. And they showed that participants spent significantly more time gazing at Black students, especially Black boys, compared to other students. The authors speculated that the teachers vigilantly attuned to the Black students' behavior, especially Black boys, given the possibility that they were holding unconsciously held beliefs that the Black boys were more likely to act out. So this is, again, hard material, and there's been kind of an increasing area of work around implicit racial bias in schools and across in society in general. And really how I've kind of thought of the work that I do is to think, okay, well, where do we go from here? I personally want, and as many of you would agree, to orient towards change and growing best practices to disrupt anti-Black racism and structures of inequality. So that brought me to restorative practices. I became interested in restorative practices and restorative justice years ago. And what got me particularly interested was the possible power of relationships to kind of address inequality in school, build trusting relationships among more marginalized and minoritized groups. So many of you are potentially doing work in RP and know a lot about it, but I do want to orient folks who don't know as much about it to some of the practices. And I will bring in some research that I've done that might be new to everybody. So the first thing I want to say is folks have really talked about how restorative practices is guided by fundamental core beliefs and values. It's not all kind of a technology of community building circles and conferencing, but there's this kind of mindset and sets of core beliefs that I've listed here. This idea that healthy relationships are fundamental, repairing harm and learning through conflict is possible, and that learning environments require justice and equity. Another piece that I want to point out about restorative practices is the notion that there's a prevention and an intervention end, in my perspective, of restorative practices. So you'll see on the far right of this graphic, the idea of building healthy relationships between educators and students. All right, so that is prevention, right? Like we're going to build community, we're going to intentionally go in and build buy-in and connection to a setting. And then there's also this other intervention piece. We know conflict occurs in communities and we want to resolve conflict, repair harm. You see that on the far left bubbles, the idea of restoration, restoring positive relationships. So what would a student in a classroom detect if a teacher was highly restorative? If we might think like a lot of this is really good teaching, but these are some of the restorative practice essential elements according to an organization called IIRP, that some of you may know. And there's an emphasis on affect, right, where the teacher is talking about their own experiences, affective experiences, soliciting their students' emotional experience in the classroom. There's this kind of problem-solving approach to conflict using restorative questions. Teachers engage in what are called community building circles or proactive circles. So there's a circle process, which I'll share with you more about. There's an emphasis on fair process, this idea of really respecting the agency and autonomy of kids, that to include them in decision-making processes. And then there's another kind of circle process to address misconduct or misbehavior, to problem solve. I'm going to share a short video with you, just 5 minutes, about 4 minutes of it. And this is, so many of you may have seen this. It's a Met West video. I like it because it gives you a flavor from the student's perspective of the circle process. So this is only one small component of restorative practice. It's kind of what restorative practice is often known for, these community building circles. Schools are running these during advisory, homeroom periods, sometimes in class, running instruction. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, about 4 minutes of it.
They come in, they're giggling, they're laughing. And there's just like a lot of kind of like giddy, intense energy.
Coming for what?
And in the circle and their relationships with each other actually kind of like quiet something in them and allow them to be more present for each other.
When we do circles here, before we do the circles, we sit down and like plan the opening ceremony. It lit. My great hope is to laugh as much as I cry, to get my work done and try to love someone. And I have enough courage to accept the love in return. Maya Angelou. And in high school especially, like, we don't have enough, connections with each other. Sometimes, everybody just all focused on the work and, stress at home and stuff like that. And circles create a space where people can talk about their feelings, about how they're doing home life. Now we will review our class values. The first one was being open.
The other one is respect.
We share our values to respect each other and stuff like that because, we all are still humans and people get sensitive sometimes. So we're trying to make sure, that everybody feels comfortable and doesn't get their feelings hurt. Okay, now we will share an object that relates to hope.
I have my I Heart Being Black bracelet because I hope that everybody is proud of who they are.
I got this play to win thing from a boyfriend. We exchange bands all the time. And this brings hope because, it just keeps me going.
My mom made this necklace for me, and it represents hope because she never had time to do anything for herself. They're being asked to be vulnerable to a group of people, which is kind of like antithetical to what it's like to be a teenager, which is what's the best way to hide right now. So the first thing that I do is I share as deeply as I possibly can. I feel like if I can share deeply and from my heart and listen really attentively to other students, they're looking at me to see how I'm behaving.
I have you guys give me a lot of hope and stuff like that. Our advisory is like a family. I've been through police brutality, tragedies and stuff like that. And instead of me being depressed about life, I know I can come in and talk to my community. They understand. And most of the time, if it's something I'm going through, they've probably already been through it before.
Okay, I'm going to stop that and keep moving here. Great. So thanks for taking a minute to check out a community building circle. You get a sense of kind of the sense of community that these kids are connecting through that process. So I went into some classrooms. This is a small scale study, but I thought it was evocative and important to share some of these findings here. I found that when students perceive their teachers as high on restorative practice, so they're doing circles, they're focused on affect and kind of problem solving around conflict together with youth, they tended to issue fewer misconduct, defiance, discipline referrals. And they tended to issue, have small gaps between African-American and Latino and white and Asian students. Whereas when students perceive their teacher as low on RP, you can see here there was a greater gaps going on. So again, I thought there was some promise here. It's correlational and small scale, but promise about this idea of kind of preventing students from going into the discipline system in general, which is what we're really looking for, this kind of interrupt the process of discipline early as kids are engaging and connected in their classrooms. And I've also been conducting research at the intervention end of things. So when I talked about restorative practice, I talked about this idea of kind of problem solving with youth around conflict. So this is a kind of a scenario where this teacher who's in yellow is speaking with some students who had conflict and using the restorative questions to help the students reflect on what happened, who was affected, and how they can make things right. And many, many schools across the nation, including many schools on this call today, have been using a restorative conference process. And in that conference process, the difference is pretty profound of moving the notion of accountability to a different spot, right? It's a real paradigm shift. When we think about students trying to understand the impact of their actions and repairing harm, it's a shift away from thinking accountability can only take the form of exclusionary discipline, that they need to kind of be removed from the community. Instead, this notion of kind of facing the harm done and kind of figuring out jointly how to repair the harm is a large paradigm shift. I worked with a colleague out at Denver, and my colleague Yoli Anyon, and we found that in schools that were using the restorative, when students participated in the restorative conference process, they were less likely to obtain a future discipline referral. So if they participated in one in the fall, they were less likely to go back into the discipline system. Relative to the students who were also sent into the discipline system but didn't participate. So this, I think, was again a promising finding from a kind of a correlational perspective about the promise of restorative practice from an intervention point of view of reducing the use of exclusionary discipline. Now, however, as these this was published in 2016, and we know restorative practices and school discipline reform has really fanned out across the nation. And what a lot of colleagues of mine I've been concerned about as discipline reform efforts have proliferated, which I think is a good thing, we've been concerned that really good intentions are really not enough. The concern is that we really need to do better at centering equity in school discipline reform. And so today, the rest of my talk, I really want to kind of grapple with this more, that many, I think, efforts have limitations around ignoring institutionalized oppression. In other words, reforms often do not consider the deeply rooted and complex socio-historical conditions that fuel disparities. We know there is a legacy of racialized violence that plagues this country. Stereotypes can justify punitive exclusionary discipline of Black and Brown students. There's also school discipline reform that kind of professes cultural neutrality. And so there's concern there that these are not culturally informed interventions of focusing on cultural assets of families and students, and do not identify the need for cultural competence among staff. Another concern is really a neglect for robust social and emotional and behavioral supports. And I know all of us, on this call, this is something we're all trying to grapple with, is thinking about, especially in this pandemic, the trauma and the stress and the adversities that families and students are facing, and how to really, as we kind of come back into schools, more and more schools return to in-person, really trying to kind of shore up the robust supports that are needed. And then the other issue that comes up, I think, a lot are this failure to address opportunities to learn. So really linking the discipline gap initiatives with the opportunity gap initiatives, that we need to increase access to rigorous and engaging instruction, especially for marginalized and minoritized groups. But yes, I think we're in an exciting moment, if I can even say that, during these challenging times. But in terms of school discipline reform, we're in a turning point where more and more people are braiding together this issue of racial justice and social justice. And these are just 3 books that I would recommend to kind of read some of this work of braiding it together. In fact, Fania Davis notes, and I actually want to quote here because I think it's a powerful quote. She sees racial justice as a social movement, restorative justice as a social movement. She says, healing interpersonal harm requires commitment to transforming the context in which injury occurs, the socio-historical conditions and institutions that are structured precisely to perpetuate harm. So a re-energized civil rights movement calls on schools for transformation. And I'm hoping we can all recognize today that the need for this kind of connection and repair and racial justice. And I wanted to bring to kind of push our thinking as a group here around, well, what does that mean to think about restorative justice from a racial and social justice lens, or restorative practices from an equity lens? So in my own journey in this work, I had the good fortune to partner with some nonprofits who were implementing restorative practices in schools in a large urban center comprised of families mostly from with low incomes. And these nonprofits had a kind of social injustice, racial justice lens in their restorative practice work. And we had funding from a private foundation. And we had many people who helped in my undergrad and grads who've helped with so much of this work. So I need to give a big shout out to them over these years. And like many restorative practices, we actually have mapped efforts onto MTSS model. So, the triangle, right? We think about this from a public health perspective. What are the restorative practices, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? And just like, I'll give you a little snippet of some of our evaluation findings from that project. Again, this was kind of a single group case study where I was deeply immersed in the rollout of restorative practice. And one thing is we kind of elevated student voice every year, capturing surveys after surveys and open-ended responses about the circle process. And one thing I wanted to just make sure to highlight is how much students were craving the type of connection we just saw in that Met West video, right? That they talked about things like the importance of self-expression, having voice, this positive quality. So a vast majority of students were able to kind of conjure up this positive experiences within circles. We also interviewed students, and I just wanted to share one interview quote that really struck me. A student was reflecting on the circle process and said, it will help staff grow because it's not just students that are part of the circle, it's the teachers too. And that's important because they need to understand where we're coming from. And they could understand maybe that's why I'm not in the mood today, or what happened this morning or last night may cause me to act out during the day. So really this idea of the student was picking up on the potential power of the circle process to increase staff members' empathy, right, and perspective taking. I think that's powerful. Now, in our longitudinal study, we did see reductions in suspension rates in these schools. And there's some growing areas in terms of experimental trials, or what are called randomized controlled trials. We've seen some a recent study showing reductions in suspension rates. So this is a correlational study. But again, we saw some practice. But remember when I said to you earlier that I got intrigued by this project because of the racial and social justice lens of the work. So that's something we also tracked in this project. Okay, well, what did that look like from the restorative practice coordinator's point of view? What were they doing that was kind of equity oriented in the work? And they had a very comprehensive vision of equity, and their efforts fell into different buckets. So these were the buckets that we kind of culled through our interviews with them. This idea of increasing student agency in itself was liberatory. Many schools were putting students on every single committee, every high-powered decision-making body, that they were doing a lot more solicitation of student perspective throughout their year. So you can already see how expansive that alone can be outside of kind of just circles and conferences, increasing student agency. They were doing kind of more systematic reviews of policies and practices that could inadvertently have an unfair impact on some groups. They were doing things like courageous conversations among staff and students about marginalizing institutional practices. So this idea of really opening up the eyes and hearts and minds of faculty to how they may be inadvertently perpetuating marginalizing practices. And also there was a focus on kind of the curricula as well in terms of a social justice education. So I find this heartening in a sense that we can think, okay, well, maybe there's a move now in our field where the school discipline reform is now intersecting better and trying to confront institutionalized oppression, to really bring in this notion of cultural relevancy and bias awareness. And the other move I've seen in the field is to take our social and emotional learning efforts and to also think about it from an equity lens, right? And so I'm going to show you something that may be very familiar to many of you, the CASEL 5, right? This is a graphic we see a lot coming in our field around what are the social emotional competencies we want to, upskill both our staff and our students. So we're all working on things like self-management during these pandemic days, self-awareness, relationship skills, et cetera. So just let me give you, I'm going to move quickly through this. You won't have time to read all these definitions, but again, it's just to kind of flow over you the idea that these are some really core skills that we're all working on. I think what's been promising in the equity-oriented work is there's been a real push to think, well, what are the implications for equity-oriented competencies, equity-oriented self-awareness, equity-oriented self-management? And this is also coming out of CASEL, and I think they're doing some important work in this area. So for example, equity-oriented self-awareness, what might that be? we can think about educators, again, increasing their self-awareness about possible negative stereotypes they might hold. For example, a colleague of mine, Eddie Fergus, and I were talking about educators who make snap judgments about students of color who sag their pants by stereotyping them as not committed to education or as prone to reject adult authority. There could also be, obviously, like this increased self-awareness. How could educators be inadvertently, in terms of drawing on implicit racial bias, how could they be inadvertently kind of more criminalizing their students of color in the disciplinary process? We also can think about things like an equity-oriented social awareness. So imagine our staff becoming much more socioculturally and historically attuned, understanding more about the kind of histories of social movements and marginalizations in this country. And that, I think, could really boil down to practice, especially if students are coming and saying, look, I feel unfairly treated or I'm experiencing racism. I think educators would have a larger frame to understand that. For many educators, I'm really emphasizing here too, for educators who have themselves not experienced marginalization. This is such a crucial process. So this is what brings me to Morningside Center. So Morningside Center and I have been partnering, and I've been really excited to work with them because they have really taken on the interweaving of restorative practice, SEL, and racial equity. So you can see this in their kind of little graphic here. That and I've been working with them actually on a project. So hold on, I'm going to back up a second. I've been working with them on a project, a federally funded project, conducting a randomized controlled trial of this project, interweaving these three strands. And I'm going to tell you more about findings from that project at the end. So bear with me, I'll get there. But I wanted to just let you know that for those of you all out who are listening, who are doing restorative practicing, interestingly enough, Morningside has a social emotional learning curricula that they fit into their circle process. So you can see the integration. It's not a standalone curricula outside of restorative practice. It's all interweaved. So for example, in their curricula, they tackle the very typical SECs, or social emotional competencies, listed here: problem solving, assertiveness, taming stress. But they also tackle things like standing up to institutionalized oppression, sharing identities, the challenges of being an ally, standing up to stereotypes, and the list goes on and on. And so that's part of this in the trial that I'm working on. This is kind of curriculum is interwoven into their initiative. And so if people are interested, they have a nice kind of animation graphic at this website, kind of which orients you to how they have a focus on this kind of larger focus around social justice and equitable education. So back to some science around randomized controlled trials. So many of you may know, but in education, we do a lot of kind of experimental trials where we do this random assignment. So this is a kind of what's considered a smaller scale randomized control trial with 18 schools. And I guess I should say first off that we've been interrupted due to the pandemic, which has been a real loss. And we're kind of picking it up now. But what I realized in starting this project was I had opportunity to speak to all these amazing restorative practice leaders in these schools and in the prior schools I already mentioned to you, where we were following them over time. So restorative practice leaders were both the implementers, the kind of consultants working with them, but also the principals. So I kind of seized the opportunity to do very in-depth interviewing with these restorative practice leaders to really understand from the ground up, what were they doing to implement restorative practices? So I wanted to really get a better sense of their grounded, from a kind of what's called a grounded theory approach. What was their conceptualization of a comprehensive equity-oriented restorative practice? So we did kind of this rigorous qualitative analysis using grounded theory. And again, there's been a lot of implementation science, right, that could help frame some of this, but I really wanted to start where the principals were at in doing the work. And what we have put together in our findings is both that article, but also I think more importantly, it's a kind of user-friendly guide to the taking the voices of the leaders in the field out there doing the work about these 12 indicators. So I'm making that available on the website if you're interested through this talk to take a look at it. Really, we designed this for use in schools to really help leaders in schools have some kind of touchstones for what are the indicators they should be thinking about as they're involved in this work. And if from the implementation science folks on the call, you'll notice things like building infrastructure for implementation, absolutely key. Building capacity building, absolutely key. Now there's two, and this is what this looks like that we'll be making available to you. There's two indicators I wanted to touch on. It's about, let's say I'm doing a time check. So I'm going to go for about another 15 minutes, if that's okay, 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll keep going because I really want to introduce you to some of these indicators. Two of the indicators I think are really striking and I want to share with you: administrative support and school-wide buy-in. Okay, so administrative support, in this indicator, what became clear through our interviews was how absolutely essential it is to have leaders doing this work who both espouse and model an equity, relationship building, and skill building approach. So what this has done is once again pointed out just the key role of educational leaders in the work. The other piece I want to point out here is that they are offering logistic and research support. So there's a combination of this visionary leader with these effective managers. And I want to share some quotes from some of our RP leaders. One leader said, "The whole idea of equity first, for me, it's not subliminal. It's absolutely intentional and direct." It might make people feel uncomfortable, this leader said, but it had to be direct. Another leader said, "I bring RP up wherever I can. For example, if I'm having a meeting with groups of teachers, whether it's about classroom management or otherwise, I'll bring up the strategy of circles." What you see here is this kind of integrationist focus where these leaders are thinking about the through lines of equity and RP and SEL throughout their day, throughout the work. It's moving away from the silos of these interventions. And I mentioned this before, this idea of being able to walk the talk and offering concrete action. Because we know so many leaders now are kind of picking up the philosophy of the work, but are they able to really put some kind of action or resource behind it? Now, the next, so I guess to me, the big call here is we're looking for these kinds of administrators and I want to understand a lot more about how the power of their kind of integrationist skills in pulling all of these threads together. The other indicator I wanted to point out is buy-in. So I should say, and a shout out to Dr. Lyon in the call and his colleague, Dr. Cook and Dr. Locke and colleagues. They showed that a school-based consultant selected improving implementation buy-in is in the top 5 most important implementation strategies out of 75 they were presented with. So I think many of you in the call will be hopefully like nodding your head, yes, this notion of buy-in. You have this kind of initiative fatigued and stressed out staff. Collective investment is crucial, yet it's really, really challenging. And I want to share some of share some quotes with you. So if you bear with me, I'm going to read this, okay? One of the leaders said this: "Some people won't sit in a responsive circle. Some people had this idea that, like, if I sat in this circle and we did this process, that when we walked away from it, there's a winner and a loser. And I may be the loser. And if I'm on the loser end, that means that I've lost of control of power in my position and in my space, and in my classroom. And more of that is given to the student. We had to begin to deconstruct that narrative," this leader said. "This is not about wins and losses, but this is about our community. How do we repair and restore and make sure that everybody is okay on both sides, that they're well and they're safe?" So I think that's important to think how, we're trying to undo these really powerful narratives around how power operates in the classroom. I'm going to share some more quotes, so bear with me, but it's so important to hear from folks from the field. Another leader said, "We've been trying to calibrate the lines between when and why suspension is necessary, and also trying to be much more intentional around what happens beforehand, what happens after, and how we communicate with students about why things like suspensions happen. We're also trying to find out how we can have our staff feel supported when a lot of people are just used to support looking like punishment for the kid. So there's a lot of mindset work that we have to do around that. It is the leaders who start to tackle these mindset, these beliefs, these narratives that I think are going to make some more inroads in implementation. All right, here we go. I have a longer quote for you. I'm preparing you for a long quote on the next slide, but I think it's really worth it. So bear with me, I'm going to read it. Here we go. It's evocative enough to be worth it. RP and cultural identity is complicated, and it's nuanced because we can't talk about cultural identity without the impact of slavery and colonialism, and how colonialism has had a direct impact on how people understand punishment and an impact on their relationship to punishment, and why and how that is essential. That is essentially the bedrock of this punitive culture that we live in. And if we're going to have an honest conversation about RJ and racial justice, we have to talk about why we have such a punitive culture and how it's very much embedded into the fabric of how we interface with one another, and that being a result of colonialism. I think there's a real thing around safety and what it means to have Black and brown students and how they should conduct themselves because their lives depend on it, and how we don't name that in the everyday, and how that tension exists right under the skin. It manifests in these very punitive policies, in a really harsh way of dealing with young people, where they have to know their place. And it may be a matter of survival in some cases, but yet, I'm adding there, in the majority of cases, it's not. But you have that unspoken understanding that it impacts every decision you make about how young people move. So this RP leader is really talking about how this kind of policing of the body, and some of it is through this kind of like protection, but how then that becomes this generalized approach to policing and monitoring and regulating. So we're left with these words to think about how the deep work it's going to take to deconstruct this narrative, to do the mindset work, to really look at the complexity and the nuance, and thinking about the impact of slavery and colonialism in the way discipline is operating today. I was in a recent training, and I asked about 35 or so school administrators to say to me, all right, what would be your guess around the buy-in in your school to transforming schools' approach to student behavior, to disrupting disparate outcomes? I ask this because over and over I'm hearing the issue of buy-in. And so I guess I challenge educators out there who have this kind of, to also ask themselves and their colleagues, what do they think the percentage of buy-in is? And interestingly enough, there was this wide range in the response. A few administrators said 90% have buy-in to this transformative approach to school discipline. But some administrators said 30% had buy-in. So I think this shows just the tremendous learning we can do at this stage of this kind of wide variation. What is the difference between these schools if we were to believe this perception, the 90% schools versus the 30%? And my thinking is that there's really an iterative process of buy-in. It can't be a one-stop shop. We probably likely have to kind of keep digging down into these belief systems around punishment, around control, that these are really fundamentally and big belief structures that might be hard to shift. So these kinds of questions come up into my head as I'm learning this from leaders, is about fostering buy-in and enabling teachers to share control, and how do we foster critical race consciousness and then shift that to anti-racist policies and practices, all big picture questions. I turn to someone like Roger's work at this time to think, well, Roger had this theory of diffusion of innovations, right? Many of you know that people have different predilections for change. So how do we think about this when we're thinking about this deep mindset shift work? So we could think that maybe there's some group, like a late majority group, right? They're kind of more cautious. They don't kind of jump on new change, but maybe they need more considered intervention with them, more role models, for example, who have themselves reflected on how power and privilege is impacting their work. Said differently, maybe they need more modeling about how to critically examine their own practice if they're inadvertently doing damage to Black and brown students. And so we could kind of start to get tighter in our work around kind of intersecting belief shifts and critical race consciousness in this work. All right, I did promise. I know there's people on the call who've done some really interesting work around support beliefs intervention that maybe could comment later too around that. But I did promise you I'd give you some findings from my recent RCT, and I want to leave on an up note, which is that I just mentioned like belief shifts could be very hard. And in this project, we only had 1 year of data so far on 1 year. And I would say that you cannot expect, huge outcomes after only 1 year of intervention. But I did want to share some promising findings. So in this RCT, it's ongoing, a multifaceted intervention. They work with on equity task force and restorative practice task force with leaders. They're training folks in restorative interventions. I mentioned before, they're implementing SEL curricula using a circle process. They also build in community building activities for the staff around courageous conversations, around reflecting on structural racism and their own cultural and racial selves. They do very similar parallel work with students to raise students' critical consciousness and sense of belonging and connection and social emotional learning skills. And the same thing with parents and families. We randomized at the school level, and we have very diverse schools, K through 12, low income, mostly Black and Latino schools. And what we found, I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase here, is that after 1 year, we did see some effects of the program. The staff in the RP program schools were higher on a measure of empathic perspective taking and a measure of cultural knowledge and beliefs relative to the staff in the business as usual schools. Now I have a bunch of measurement slides next, but I know that I want to open for Q&A. So I'll just be brief with those slides. We measured empathy by having teachers respond to a vignette, a discipline vignette, and we had them kind of write in, what do you think the disputant who kind of talked to you, talked back at you in the back of the room, what were they feeling? What were they going through? So we were looking for staff being able to take the perspective of the very student who was involved in the discipline interaction. We coded those answers. And teachers who had kind of more nuanced and complex responses were scored higher. Teachers who showed more understanding of the possible vulnerability that that student was feeling, not just kind of a blanket, oh, they were just being disrespectful, but we were really looking for kind of more nuance and understanding the complexity of that student's experience potentially. We coded them as higher on empathic perspective taking. So again, in our intervention, teachers were coded as higher than the control condition, or the teachers who, the faculty who were not involved in those restorative practice initiatives. In terms of cultural awareness, we found that teachers in our interventions, in our intervention schools were more likely, for example, to say teachers bring stereotypes that affect their views of students of color and how they teach them. They were more likely to agree that Black students are forced to deal with many pressures that threaten their identity as Black students. They were less likely to agree that students of color do not experience racism on a daily basis. It's a bit of a double negative after a long talk, but so I guess I would end with that kind of this promise that there was some shifts in beliefs. And to me, just to summarize then, I think we're in a new stage. We're in a time of racial reckoning. We have exacerbated inequity through the pandemic, where school discipline reform is really confronting kind of larger issues related to institutionalized oppression, increasing cultural relevancy, and explicitly tying in social emotional learning and linking to instructional practice in some of the work. So I think it's an important time in school discipline reform to really, really start keep tackling, reducing that persistent disparity that I showed you at the beginning in terms of those suspension rates, especially for Black students. So I'm gonna just conclude with an urgency for all of us to continue this work. We see that there's a widening in inequity through the pandemic. We're entering into this next phase of this pandemic. More students are returning to schools. I think we're gonna get a better grasp on just how much divides have widened. This urgency for connection, given all the physical distancing we have, is underscored. We see increasing rates of mental health distress among our youth. The idea of focusing on repair and racial justice is absolutely urgent. And then finally, I just want to ask folks to continue to reach out to one another who are doing this is hard work. And we need to kind of amplify pockets of hope and resilience during this time where we link arms in this work. And given the profound fissures in our society, the entrenched inequities that have been really laid just so bare during the pandemics of COVID and racism. So thank you so much for your attention today.
Yes. Well, first I'm going to introduce myself, everyone. Hi, my name is Kathy Corbin. I am a postdoc here at the Smart Center, and I'm going to be co-facilitating the Q&A with my colleague who is going to introduce herself now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie. I work for the School Mental Health Supplement at MHTDC from the Smart Center.
Yes, and before we jump into some really great questions from the audience, I just want to express extreme gratitude for this work that you presented, and I've seen a lot of excitement in the chat box, a lot of affirmation, not just for the work you've done, but your commitment to seeing it exist in the world, in our schools. So the first question we have is really about fidelity of restorative justice or restorative practices in schools. And someone was wondering how can school staff know if they're doing it well or doing enough of it, and particularly the difference between accuracy, adherence, and dosage in restorative practice, given the, I assume given the multi-component structure of it.
What I love, this is like my obsession. So thank you for jumping in, because you know, I think the person who asked that knows well that we desperately need to be thinking about fidelity in a multidimensional way. But there's this issue of feasibility. We could come up with all the plans we want around using validated observational tools, et cetera. But what's feasible to do, right? That's really, you know, schools have so many initiatives, so much going on, that I want to start with that instead of painting this kind of pie in the sky fidelity matrix. You know, some things that I center student voice on this. So a lot of schools have these amazing, let's talk about high school, middle school, student leaders for restorative practice. In one of the schools I was working in where we were watching this implementation fold out for 3.5 years, they harnessed the power of the student leaders to lead fidelity initiatives. So the student leaders could go in, they would be in a circle process with a fidelity checklist to say, all right, how's this go? They work in collaboration with the teacher, right? To say, we're here to help support this. This is a tricky move, right? But they were really deployed. So they had, you know, many students kind of deployed to go out and check fidelity. So I thought that was just amazing work. And that empowers, and also think of all the skills you get as a student when you're observing and you're figuring out how to kind of offer constructive feedback. That's such amazing professional development for the students themselves. The other thing that I've done a lot are these quick exit slips when students leave a restorative practice experience, like a 6-item anonymous shoe, literally, we made shoe boxes, like throw it in at the end, you know? And where we're tapping into things like, where's your voice heard? Was it engaging? Was it relevant? Did you feel safe? You know, I try to tap into some of the fundamental features of a good circle process. So I think though, okay, so that's the kind of just a slice, and also in Minnesota, they're doing some really cool stuff where they have, after conferences, they have some quick surveys, they do follow up with the family members there. So I think districts have really tried to integrate some feedback loops. Now, in terms of the research on what's the tipping point for dosage or adherence, we don't have great research on that. I get asked this a lot, like, well, you know, if we're going to focus on community building efforts, how much should we do that? You know, and I guess I would say a lot, because we want to be thinking about building community, not just in circles, but just intentionally throughout the school, in the hallway, you know, as people return from the pandemic or they're going in hybrid or even online virtual learning, to be thinking about community building. But again, we don't have a strong research base that as of yet, so maybe in 10 years, it's a slow road, where we can have more precise answers about like tipping points around some of this work. But great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as you were talking, a question just came in that I think is related. So someone was wondering how we can promote buy-in for centering student voices. And this person near and dear to my heart, they don't know it, but specifically in elementary school, because I think, you know, a lot of times we think younger kids don't have the agency to advocate for themselves and so on and so forth.
I think that's a great question. I think that the how issue is, I think we're kind of continuing on in collecting information about how principals are doing that. There are so many amazing educators out there centering student voice, right? And then many of you are on the call right now. One thing that educators have told me again and again in some of my research is experiential learning. You have those teachers that need to be strategically paired with those other teachers, right? Key opinion leaders who are well respected, where those teachers model. So I remember sitting in on a principal meeting where she had a task force of elementary kids, right? I think it went from kindergarten to 5th grade, task force on school climate. And she led this magical meeting where the students were writing lists and they were developing ideas. And I thought, this is the moment to get those teachers in the room who don't understand the power of this process. And they need to see it and they need to feel it and taste it in a way, like they need to be there. And so I think doing like that social engineering, really strategic pairing of different types of teachers who are going to be modeling those efforts. I also was in a school where a principal would do this stealth PD where they would have teachers just swap for 10 minutes. And you'd see teachers going down hallways just to sit. And in his mind, he had it all mapped out. Like, I need teacher A to see teacher B running this student voice activity and just sitting in on it. And there was an openness to it. I should say that there was a very collegial openness to it. So it wasn't a formal PD. It was a 10-minute sampling of, wow, look at my colleague just rocking it out in this area. So those are the kind of exciting initiatives that are out there.
Great. This is great. Another question is, I've been thinking about group work when we get back to in-person. Anxiety to be back in the world will be huge. Virus, racism, school, dynamics, work and social will all be a factor. My school has a lot of different cultures. I'm thinking about shifting from traditional EB group structures and start with talking circles. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. For students who identify greater need, we could offer anxiety groups. I'm curious what your thoughts on this would be.
My thoughts are yes, please. I mean, I think that what I'm hearing from some schools is they're not forefronting social emotional, experiences in these returns, that I think, and of course there's the staff. Let's not forget the staff and all their needs social for returning and being able to make time even virtually to express their fears and concerns. But there's a lot of good resources out there. I did give a shout out to the Morningside Center, but they have a lot of great circle ideas. Kay Pranis, Circle Forward, a great book, lots of circle ideas out there. But I think, yes, this is going to be an essential time to do from a kind of just like in any MTSS process and carving out time for kids to reconnect and surface just the very experience of coming back together.
Awesome. The mentioning of the circle time or circle groups was a great segue into the next question, which is someone was wondering how you might adapt many of the questions. I think that were either in the videos or on one of your slides. I can't quite remember the exact context. But some of the questions for students who might have special needs. So how do you bring in students with disabilities into these restorative practices?
Yeah, I mean, and all the work that I've done, there's been students, in kind of mainstreamed and integrated classrooms, that there, or even we also have at pull-out classrooms and running these in smaller circles. So sometimes we do have kind of more selected circles that are kind of more purposefully built in a way. So that's something to think about, is how many and what the composition is and who's leading it. And do you have students in there with kind of mixed abilities to do some modeling? So I think just like any activity, you want to be mindful of the group composition.
Excellent. Another question is, how can you situate RP with ESSA recommended MTSS PBIS approach?
Well, I mean, I think within ESSA, there's also kind of a push for reducing exclusionary discipline, right? So I think it fits within that. I think as I showed you that kind of triangle, that a lot of schools are doing the PBIS, RP, equity melange, right? They're pulling it together. I think what is important though is given how many initiatives are occurring, and I think I was really trying to raise this, is that we really have to think about how it's braided together, you know, in terms of, I would argue, core central tenets. It's too confusing if you have all these different initiatives, but if you have to think, okay, well, yes, we're pulling from, let's say, the PBIS focus on use of data, right? And using discipline data. So how does that reflect a core tenet of the work that's also a kind of a cycle of inquiry that we honor in this school? So I just use that as an example to say, I think PBIS is focused on positive praise, as also connecting to positive relationship building. And so really helping educators, which is fundamental to restorative practice, helping educators see the through line in the work and not just feel like it's a patchwork quilt, but say, here's some guiding principles. A good one is community and relationship building and positive interactions, which I think ties very nicely into PBIS. So I think I think it's incumbent on educational leaders to really identify those through lines with their staff so people just don't feel like, you know, so much is coming at them.
Great. And I think we have time for probably one more question, though if it goes quickly, maybe we can fit in two. So someone was wondering about or asking for a little more information about how teaching educators about implicit bias figures into this work. And I'll extend that to even ask more about some more specifics about adult-centered SEL, because I think those are very highly correlated things. So anything you can say about some of that work in the restorative practice framework.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working with Morningside. They have a very, essential piece of this. Their focus is on issues around racial equity and raising kind of bias awareness. And, you know, we talk about words like cultural fluency. I think what strikes me in their work is they say, look, we can't do this work without developing some core social emotional competencies among the group. Right? That they're oriented towards trust building and norm setting always in the beginning of their racial equity work. And that is, Kathy, to get to your question about social emotional competencies among the staff. So all of their trainings in PD are scaffolded towards trust building as they kind of working towards talking about things like white supremacy, racial implicit bias, the history of kind of oppressive laws in this country and resistance movements. It's very mindfully kind of cascaded to engage people and to kind of not inflict. I mean, I think this is the challenge, right? It's like you don't want to inflict more damage, especially for staff who've experienced through their own social positionality, marginalization and minoritization. And so, you know, one needs to be kind of mindful of not wanting to inflict more harm, right? But you want to kind of have, like, for example, they do things like affinity groups. They kind of pull groups apart at some point after trust building stages where folks of color come together for particular activities, and then white folks go together for other sets of activities, and then they come back for an exchange. So things like that, I think, need to be mindfully and done in a scaffolded way.
Great. And I think we're right up against our time, so I'm going to hand it off to Natalie.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory, for this whole presentation. And thank you all for being here. This was an excellent talk. As we close, we ask you to please complete a brief evaluation, and the link can be found in the chat box. Please be sure to select the right event from the dropdown for the evaluations. They're required by our funders, and we are using them to help inform future trainings. Please do us a favor and share your feedback. It's more important now than ever to communicate the needs for support you have to our federal funders. And of course, certificates of completion and clock hour forms for Washington State educators can be accessed at the end of the evaluation as well. Again, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much, Dr. Gregory.